From complete darkness, a single beam of golden light slowly breaks through, beginning to illuminate something truly magnificent being built. War, betrayal, civil revolution, and fragile, uneasy peace. The devastating events of Part 2 that brought us to this moment. Part 3. The Sun King Rises, the Age of Absolutism. From 1650 to 1675, Europe would never be the same again. By 1650, Europe's entire center of gravity had shifted decisively and permanently, and the name of that new center was France. Chapter 1. The Fronde. A kingdom torn apart by civil war and the violent forging of an absolute king. Young Louis observed everything with quiet intensity, a watchful child positioned carefully between a powerful mother and a calculating cardinal. Cardinal Mazarin, the silky Italian-born statesman who inherited Richelieu's grand, ruthless, and deeply ambitious design for French greatness. In 1648, the streets of Paris erupted in open and violent rebellion. The Fronde had begun, and no one was safe. The torch-carrying mob was at the palace gates. The terrified boy king stood at his window and watched, forever changed. In the dark of night, the royal family slipped secretly out of Paris in a disguised carriage, humiliated and deeply afraid. The great princes and nobles raised private armies and turned them directly against the crown. France was tearing itself apart. Frenchmen slaughtered Frenchmen across the countryside. The devastation mirrored the worst horrors of the 30 Years' War that had just ended. Spain eagerly crossed the border to support the rebels, delighted to pour salt into France's wide-open wounds. Exiled, but never truly powerless, Mazarin continued to govern France entirely through a constant and careful stream of secret letters. The Fronde finally collapsed, not through any military defeat, but entirely from its own bitter and irreconcilable internal contradictions. In 1653, Louis XIV rode back into Paris in quiet triumph. He smiled graciously at everyone he passed. He forgot absolutely nothing. He surveyed every bowing and smiling courtier face around him, and behind every gesture of loyalty, he remembered precisely who had betrayed him. The very moment Mazarin drew his final breath, Louis XIV stood before his court and announced there would be no first minister after him. The entire court stood in stunned, disbelieving silence. The king was 22 years old. He intended to govern France entirely alone. Every morning council session, every state document, every diplomatic correspondence, every military decision, Louis XIV governed all of it completely personally. Finance Minister Fouquet threw a party of such breathtaking personal splendor that it outshone the king himself. He was arrested within weeks. Louis toured Fouquet's magnificent chateau in careful silence, said nothing to anyone, made a quiet private decision, and began planning Versailles. Chapter 2. Building Versailles. The story of how one king's ambition became the most extraordinary palace ever constructed on Earth. It began as a simple royal hunting lodge in the marshlands outside Paris. What it would become would astonish the entire civilized world. 36,000 workers labored simultaneously. Marshes were completely drained. Hills were physically relocated. An entire landscape remade entirely by royal command. Architects Lefebvre and later the brilliant Hardot and Mansart continuously expanded the vision far beyond anything that had originally been imagined or planned. André Laintré designed vast geometric gardens with fountains and perfectly clipped terraces that seemed to stretch endlessly toward the horizon. 357 mirrors faced 17 arched windows. The Hall of Mirrors became a gallery of endlessly multiplied golden light. On the soaring painted ceilings far above, Louis XIV appeared triumphant as Apollo the sun god, a mortal king elevated to divinity through art. Hundreds of workers died from accidents, disease, and sheer exhaustion at the Versailles construction site. Great glory has always carried a terrible human price. The fountains alone required a stunning feat of engineering, an enormous hydraulic machine pumping Seine river water for many miles through underground pipes. Louis XIV visited the construction site personally every single day, making exacting decisions on every column, every ceiling, every garden path himself. Versailles was never merely a palace of extraordinary beauty. It was a brilliantly conceived gilded cage designed specifically to control the French nobility. Chapter 3. Colbert and the State. The story of how one methodical genius rebuilt France's economy from the ground up. Jean-Baptiste Colbert, the intensely methodical and tireless minister who constructed France's entire economic machine almost completely from scratch under Louis XIV. Protect French manufacturing, restrict foreign imports, accumulate national wealth through trade. This was Colbert's mercantilist doctrine translated directly into governing policy. State-sponsored tapestry workshops, royal porcelain manufacturers, finest luxury goods. France would deliberately lead all of Europe in quality, craft, and prestige. When Colbert arrived, France possessed almost no meaningful naval power whatsoever. He methodically built a formidable ocean-going fleet entirely from nothing. Trading posts in India, Sugar Islands in the Caribbean, rich fur trade routes through the vast forests of Canada, France went global. The Canal du Midi physically connected the Atlantic Ocean to the Mediterranean Sea. France was literally stitching its own territory together through engineering. Colbert pushed persistently to extend taxation to the nobility and clergy. The privileged classes pushed back with equal persistence. Some things could not be reformed. In 1666, Louis XIV founded and personally patronized the Royal Academy of Sciences in Paris. France was deliberately and systematically investing in the future. Chapter 4. The English Experiment. The story of a republic that couldn't survive without becoming the very thing it had destroyed. Oliver Cromwell, Lord Protector of England, Scotland, and Ireland, a committed Republican in public name, an iron-fisted military dictator in every actual practice. In Ireland, Cromwell's armies demonstrated absolutely no mercy at all. The massacres at Drogheda and Wexford shocked even hardened observers across Europe. Catholic Irish landowners and farmers were systematically stripped of all their land and forcibly driven westward into the barren rocky margins of Connaught. England's navigation acts were a calculated and direct assault on Dutch commercial supremacy, economic warfare carefully dressed up in the respectable language of legislation. The First Anglo-Dutch War erupted across the seas. Two powerful, determined, and evenly matched fleets collided repeatedly and violently in the North Sea. Admiral Martin Tromp against Admiral Robert Blake, two brilliant and equally matched naval commanders dueling across a long series of massive fleet engagements. When Parliament resisted his will one too many times, Cromwell had his soldiers physically clear the chamber. "Take away that bauble," he reportedly said. Theaters permanently shuttered, maypoles torn down and burned. Christmas celebrations strictly forbidden. England endured under suffocating gray and deeply joyless Puritan moral authority. Cromwell was solemnly offered the crown of England by Parliament. He agonized publicly for weeks before refusing, but the temptation had clearly been real. Cromwell died in September 1658. His son, Richard, inherited the title of Protector, but possessed absolutely none of his father's iron authority or vision. Without Cromwell's commanding personality holding everything together, England rapidly descended into bitter competing military factions, political paralysis, and spreading public exhaustion. General George Monk marched his disciplined and loyal army steadily southward from Scotland, carrying a carefully hidden intention that would alter English history entirely. Charles II signed the Declaration of Breda from Dutch exile, promising forgiveness and political reconciliation. A deeply war-weary England was cautiously willing to listen. In May 1660, Charles II stepped ashore at Dover to an England that was absolutely and unreservedly overjoyed to welcome its monarchy home again. Theaters reopened immediately and joyfully. Color, music, and laughter flooded back into English life. The whole kingdom seemed to exhale after 11 gray years. Cromwell's body was dragged from its grave at Westminster and subjected to posthumous public execution. The restored monarchy settled its scores even with the dead. Chapter 5. The Dutch Golden Age. The extraordinary story of a small republic that somehow became the cultural and commercial center of the world. Amsterdam in 1650 stood as the undisputed wealthiest, most cosmopolitan, and most intellectually vibrant city anywhere in the entirety of Europe or beyond. The Dutch East India Company, the VOC, operated as the most powerful, most profitable, and most far-reaching commercial corporation in all of recorded human history. In his Amsterdam studio, Rembrandt van Rijn was painting The Night Watch, a masterpiece of human drama that would outlast every empire around it. In quiet Delft, Johannes Vermeer studied the way window light fell across a simple domestic face and captured it with breathtaking and permanent perfection. Amsterdam's synagogues, Catholic chapels, and Protestant churches of every denomination stood peacefully side by side. Dutch tolerance was not idealism, it was competitive commercial policy. In a humble lens-grinding workshop in Amsterdam, Baruch Spinoza was quietly developing philosophical ideas that would challenge every religious and political authority across Europe. Johann de Witt served as Grand Pensionary, leading the Dutch Republic with exceptional intelligence, proving that a merchant republic could rival the greatest monarchies. The Second Anglo-Dutch War erupted in 1665 as England aggressively targeted Dutch trade routes, commercial colonies, and maritime supremacy across multiple global theaters. In June 1667, a Dutch fleet sailed boldly and audaciously up the Thames River itself and destroyed the English navy while it sat helplessly at anchor. The great English flagship Royal Charles was boarded, captured, and triumphantly towed back to the Netherlands, the ultimate trophy of an almost unimaginable national humiliation. Chapter 6. The Great Plague and Fire, two catastrophes that struck London within a single year and left the city forever transformed. In 1665, red-painted crosses began appearing on the doors of London houses. The Great Plague had arrived silently and was spreading fast. Death carts rolled through the London streets calling at night. Plague pits were hastily dug at the edges of the overwhelmed and terrified city. The wealthy loaded their carriages and escaped to clean country air. The poor had absolutely nowhere to flee and no means to do so. Before it was over, 100,000 Londoners lay dead. The weekly bills of mortality recorded numbers that were almost impossible to comprehend or believe. In early September 1666, a small uncontrolled fire started in a Pudding Lane bakery. Within hours, all of London was in mortal danger. For 4 consecutive days, the fire consumed everything before it: wooden houses, narrow medieval streets, entire ancient neighborhoods reduced entirely to smoking ash and rubble. St. Paul's Cathedral itself was engulfed and collapsed in the flames. Molten lead from its own roof poured in rivers down the surrounding streets below. 80% of the entire city of London was completely gone in 4 days. Tens of thousands of stunned citizens fled carrying whatever they could save. Christopher Wren walked calmly through the still smoking ruins, surveying the devastation with an architect's eye, and immediately began sketching a more glorious city to replace it. Chapter 7. Louis XIV, the Sun King, the absolute monarchy fully realized. The imagery of Apollo pervaded every painting, every ceiling, every coin, every royal ceremony. Each morning, without exception, the entire assembled court gathered silently in the royal bedchamber to watch the king ceremonially rise from his bed. This was the lever. Noble dukes and princes competed fiercely and desperately for the honor of handing the king his shirt at dressing, or holding his candle at night. Louis XIV dined formally in public before a watching court audience every single day. The act of eating had been elevated into an elaborate state performance. Court fashion was deployed as a deliberate political weapon. Trends set by the king that quietly but systematically drained noble fortunes on silk, lace, and powdered wigs. Molière performed his brilliant comedies before the assembled court at Versailles, gently and dangerously satirizing the very aristocratic world that applauded him from gilded chairs. Jean-Baptiste Lully composed magnificent operas and ballets to fill the halls of Versailles, and Louis XIV himself danced with evident pride in the royal productions. The gardens of Versailles in their full afternoon glory, 300 fountains playing simultaneously, courtiers promenading through geometric perfection, light and water combined into paradise. Chapter 8. The Wars of the Sun King. How Louis XIV's ambitions brought France to the peak of European power and began building its enemies. The Marquis de Louvois systematically reorganized the French army from top to bottom, creating the most professional, most disciplined, and most formidable military force in all Europe. Sébastien Vauban, the supreme military engineer of the entire age, designed a network of impregnable fortresses so perfect they set the standard for the next century. In 1667, massive French armies crossed into the Spanish Netherlands, claiming vast territories through the legal doctrine of devolution and the right of royal inheritance. Fortress after Spanish-held fortress fell with cold mathematical precision as Vauban's methodical parallel trench siege operations reduced every defensive position in sequence. England, the Netherlands, and Sweden rapidly united in the Triple Alliance. Alarmed by the speed of French territorial expansion, the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle ended the war. France kept some gains. Louis kept all of his unsatisfied ambitions. Behind closed doors, Louis XIV began plotting cold, methodical revenge against the Dutch Republic that had dared to contain him. French diplomats secretly bribed Charles II of England with gold to abandon the Triple Alliance through the Treaty of Dover. In 1672, 120,000 French soldiers crossed the Rhine in overwhelming force. The Dutch had nowhere to run. Dutch fortress after fortress fell with shocking speed. The entire republic descended into full national panic as the French advanced. In desperate sacrifice, the Dutch opened their own dikes and deliberately flooded their farmland, destroying their land to save their nation. From the national crisis emerged William III of Orange, young, cold, utterly determined, and completely unafraid of Louis XIV. The brothers de Witt were torn apart by an orange mob in the street. Republican leadership died with them that day. William III began building a broad coalition. Spain, Austria, and the German princes, all united against French dominance of Europe. Chapter 9. The Ottoman Frontier. While Europe bled in the west, a revived Ottoman power was pressing hard from the east. Under the Kangol Grand Viziers, the Ottoman Empire was experiencing a genuine, dangerous, and carefully organized military revival. For over 2 exhausting decades, Ottoman and Venetian forces fought a grinding war of attrition for control of the island of Crete. In 1669, after a 21-year siege, Candia finally fell. Venice's centuries-long dominion over Crete ended completely and permanently. Along the Habsburg frontier in Hungary, Ottoman raiding and border pressure continued without pause, a constant grinding threat to Christian Europe's eastern edge. In the Ukrainian steppe, the Cossack hetmanate revolted against Polish rule, shifting allegiance desperately between the Ottomans and a rising Russia. Chapter 10. Science and Thought. While kings built palaces and armies marched, a few quiet men were changing how humanity understood everything. In Cambridge, Isaac Newton passed sunlight through a prism and watched the entire spectrum of colors unfold before his astonished eyes. Working alone during the plague years, Newton simultaneously developed both calculus and a complete mathematical theory of universal gravitation. Robert Boyle conducted precise, repeatable experiments on gas pressure, helping lay the essential foundations of what would become modern chemistry. In 1660, the Royal Society of London was founded, a permanent, institutional home for sharing and testing natural philosophical discoveries. Christian Huygens built improved telescopes, correctly identified Saturn's rings, and gave the entire world the accurate pendulum clock. Antony van Leeuwenhoek pressed his eye to a tiny lens and discovered an entire invisible universe of microscopic life in a water drop. Thomas Hobbes published Leviathan, arguing coldly that only absolute sovereign power could prevent humanity from destroying itself in perpetual war. John Locke was quietly developing a profoundly different argument, one grounded in natural rights, consent, and the limits of legitimate power. Chapter 11. The Wider World, 1650 to 1675. While Europe dominated these decades, the rest of the world was equally in motion. The Qing dynasty consolidated its grip on all of China, crushing Ming resistance and imposing Manchu cultural authority over the Han population. In 1661, a young child ascended the Qing throne as the Kangxi Emperor, beginning a 60-year reign that would transform China. In Delhi, Emperor Aurangzeb reversed decades of religious tolerance, systematically dismantling the pluralist legacy that Akbar had spent a lifetime carefully building. In the Deccan Highlands, the brilliant Shivaji forged an independent Maratha kingdom through mountain guerrilla warfare and fierce resistance to Mughal authority. Beneath Tokugawa peace, Japanese culture quietly flourished. Kabuki theater, woodblock printing, and a sophisticated merchant culture all reaching remarkable heights. Across Africa, the rising Ashanti and Dahomey kingdoms and the ancient Ethiopian empire continued developing complex and entirely self-directed political institutions. New Amsterdam became New York. English settlements spread. European names and flags were being stamped across the American landscape at accelerating speed. Sugar and tobacco plantation profits expanded enormously across the Americas, and the brutal transatlantic slave trade expanded in direct proportion alongside them. Chapter 12. The World in 1675, a moment to pause and understand just how much had transformed in 25 extraordinary years. Louis XIV stood dominant at the center of European power, but across the continent, coalitions and deep resentments were quietly forming against him. England's monarchy had been restored, but Parliament had been permanently restored alongside it. No future king would simply be able to ignore that. The Dutch Republic had survived French invasion and continued to lead the world in commerce, artistic achievement, and freedom of thought. Newton, Huygens, Boyle, Leeuwenhoek. The scientific revolution was accelerating at a pace that no church or court could fully control. The age of religious warfare was fading from European diplomacy, replaced by the cold calculations of state interest and balance of power. Versailles was nearing its magnificent completion, and every ambitious monarch in Europe was already planning their own lesser imitation of its grandeur. Ahead lay the Ottoman armies at Vienna, the glorious revolution in England, and the wars of Louis XIV that would exhaust an entire continent. Part 3, The Sun King Rises, is complete. The golden sun sets magnificently behind the silhouette of Versailles as an age reaches its height. Subscribe now for Part 4, The Balance of Power, where royal ambitions meet their limits and the modern world begins to take its shape.